Right, good morning, everybody. In addition to working in research with the College of Estate Management, I also happen to be chairman of the board of 3CPD Limited, which is bringing you this conference today. So I'm doubly hoping that you're going to have a thoroughly interesting and enjoyable time. I'm here to talk about the latest report to be produced by College of Estate Management Research. It's not quite published yet, but it will be this spring. And it's called Waterproof, and it's about flood risk and due diligence for commercial property investment in the UK. Now, whenever I've talked to people about this project, they've kind of said to me, well, why did you decide to research flood risk and commercial property? So I'm going to start with answers to these three questions. Why flood risk, why commercial property investment, and why due diligence? So first off, why flood risk? Well, we've already heard from Matt about how flooding poses an increasing threat to property, why it's being taken so seriously by the insurance industry, and how a new way forward is needed if flood risk cover is to continue to be offered by UK insurers. Overall, flooding is a complex risk, and although lessons are being learned from the major flood events of recent years, the interpretation of flood risk is still generally not very well understood. Secondly, back in 2006, the college published a report on flood risk and property, and that found that plenty of studies had been done on impacts of flooding on people in their homes and their businesses and on property development, but there was very little about commercial property and investment. And that earlier research also found that while the risk of flooding is increasing, investors generally weren't monitoring the risk to property that they hold in their portfolio. And as we know, investments can be held for a very long time. We could be talking 10, 20 years, maybe longer. Therefore, if checks aren't made, investors could go unaware of an increased threat and fail to take measures that could combat or mitigate that risk. Thirdly, in April this year, we have the Flood and Water Management Act 2010 starts to be introduced, and that has implications for property, which I'll touch on a bit later. Next, why commercial property investment? Well, here I'm talking about direct property investment by major institutional funds like pension funds and insurers. And while property only represents about 4.8% of their UK assets, it has a total value of around about 98 billion, so that's still very significant. Retail property is the biggest share of that at around 36%, and an example of a high-profile property is the Meadowhall Shopping Centre in Sheffield, which was closed by flooding for several days in 2006 and had to undergo major refurbishment. The next biggest slice is central London office investments, representing about 20%, and London has been identified as one of the most at-risk megacities globally because of the high asset worth and exposure to natural hazards, hence the need to renew the Thames Barrier. So property investments tend to be very large, and while they bring higher returns than some other asset types, such as investment in cash or shares, they also entail higher risks. Now, of course, institutional investment is underpinning pensions and insurance and savings plans that affect all of us, so it's vitally important that it's done with care and prudence. The governance of these funds is regulated by the Pensions Act and the UK Stewardship Code that came in 2010, but ultimately it relies on the decisions and actions of fund trustees and managers, and their prime concern has to be the security of income from property, which underpins capital values and investment returns, and flooding is one of the risks that can threaten that security by disrupting occupation and adding to costs if damage cannot be fully covered by insurance. Therefore, as an asset, property is very directly exposed to environmental risks, including flooding. But investors, as owners, are also well placed to take actions to mitigate and manage and adapt to those risks. And they're taking environmental risks much more seriously than ever before. And that's why we need to talk about due diligence, because this is the process for identifying the risks associated with a property, reducing uncertainties about the impact of the risk on property value, and informing decisions about making property investments. Now, this diagram is from a report by PricewaterhouseCoopers and illustrates the main components of real estate due diligence. Investigations for flood risk fall largely within environmental due diligence, but also overlap with technical, legal and market due diligence. Technical due diligence, which includes building surveys, market due diligence, including property valuation, and legal due diligence, which is concerned with allocating risks in legal contracts, initially for the purchase, but which could include development and onward leasing agreements. So you can see there's a lot of people and professional disciplines who are important to the due diligence process, whose advice feeds into the final investment decision, and who all need to know something about flood risk, and who arguably all need access to the same information base when they're advising on a particular property transaction. And that brings me on to talk about the purpose and approach to this research. Firstly, the aim is to provide an insight into the changing approach to mitigating, managing and adapting to flood risks when making commercial investments. And the report provides a review of the sources of guidance. What this does is to show that flood risk has unique considerations, but is also integral to considering wider environmental risks. Because I know how it is working in a busy office when you need to find guidance on a particular issue and it's kind of split up all over the place, and that can make it really difficult and time-consuming to get hold of. The aim of this report is to provide a commentary on the sources relevant to flood risk, show how they interrelate, and help make it easier to track down that information. Then the report also contains case studies illustrating the roles of different professionals, showing how they are involved in conducting due diligence exercises and the way that they interact. So looking at the process from the viewpoint of the investor, the environmental consultant, valuer, lawyer and lender. And also case studies are used to illustrate how flood risk information is used in investment decisions and in devising steps to mitigate or manage that risk. So the research involved interviews with investment managers in major institutions like Legal & General, Prudential, Land Securities, and also with professional advisors, including environmental consultants, valuers and lawyers. And I got to speak with a commercial banker and also with policy advisors at the ABI, hence we have Matt here with us today. Now I'm just going to throw in a couple of very short case studies to help illustrate why flood risk due diligence is important before talking a bit more about the process. And these are both cases from a major investor. The first is about a supermarket that actually thrived during the flooding because while other businesses were underwater, this store still had an access road and remained open for trading. That's why this surveyor said that if due diligence shows a property as being in a floodplain or in a flood risk area, we don't just say we won't buy it, we investigate further, and you have to keep delving to get to that level of information. The second is an office investment which was adapted to mitigate flooding, where the vulnerable plant and equipment in a basement and ground floor was moved to the roof. Because if, say, the electrical switchgear gets flooded, well, then the whole building can be out of operation. But in this case, with the ground floor and undercroft used just for parking, just under half would be available at all times. So an occupier would be inconvenienced, but they could still operate and the risk is manageable. I guess that's unless the MD hasn't parked his Maserati in the basement. Now, what both the